Jordan Peterson y Alex Kaiser juntos en un podcast. ¡Wow! Esto sí que suena interesante. Así que si te gusta el trabajo de este par de cracks, no te pierdas esta videoreacción porque estoy seguro que tendremos mucho que comentar. Así es que no me enrollo más y vamos allá. A estas alturas donde las redes sociales permean nuestro diario quehacer, creo que sería muy raro que alguien no conociera a estos dos personajes. Sin embargo, si hay alguien por ahí o algún ermitaño digital que no los conozca, diré algunas cosas básicas sobre ellos para saber de quién se trata. Muy bien, Jordan Peterson es psicólogo clínico y doctor en psicología. También es profesor de la Universidad de Toronto. Es una figura muy controvertida y ha construido un reconocimiento a nivel mundial por sus puntos de vista sobre la cultura, política y filosofía. Es también muy crítico con la ideología de género. De manera recurrente ha tenido debates muy interesantes con feministas. Es un hombre que promueve y enfatiza los valores tradicionales como la familia y el trabajo duro y honesto, pues los ve como los pilares fundamentales de nuestra sociedad. También se ha distinguido por defender la libertad de expresión, incluso opiniones que pueden llegar a ser muy impopulares o políticamente incorrectas. Y lo han querido cancelar, infinidad de veces. Pero ¿saben qué? No cede ante la ira de las jaurías woke. Bien, ¿y qué podemos decir de Axel Kaiser? Axel es profesor universitario y su filosofía se asocia a la Escuela Austriaca de Economía. Es fundador y director de la Fundación para el Progreso. Es un think tank que promueve las políticas justamente liberales en habla hispana. Además, es un gran defensor del libre mercado y es invitado ocasionalmente para debatir en la televisión chilena sobre temas económicos y sociales. Por último, es un acérrimo crítico del populismo y de la intervención estatal de la economía en los países. Sobre estos dos personajes he leído algunos libros de su extensa obra, pero confieso que estoy más familiarizado con el quehacer intelectual de Axel, ya que he leído por ahí 3 libros, si no mal recuerdo el primero que leí fue La tiranía de la igualdad, luego El economista callejero y el último, si no me falla la memoria, fue La neoinquisición. Y de Jordan Peterson solamente he leído su libro más famoso que se llama 12 reglas para vivir, pero también he visto varias disertaciones y el famoso debate con el filósofo esloveno Zizek. Empecemos a ver, pues, el primer clip que me pareció interesante.
All right, so there's a lot in what you just said. So let me take it apart piece by piece. You said, for example, that if you vote in the socialists, you don't get to vote them out. And so we probably want to draw a distinction, or at least have a discussion about socialism versus communism, or a discussion about whether or not that distinction is even reasonable. It's definitely the case that in some Western countries, more left-leaning regimes are voted in and voted out with some degree of regularity. Canada has a socialist party, the New Democratic Party, and it has never won an election federally and is unlikely ever to do so, I would say, because it never seems to gain more than about 20% of the population. But it's certainly run many provinces and, often not cataclysmically, sometimes even intelligently, depending on who it was that was running the show, let's say. So, and then, of course, people tend to presume that countries like Sweden and Denmark and Norway are socialist countries, even though fundamentally they adhere to free market principles. So do you want to distinguish first for maybe some definitions? What do you think the difference is between a socialist country and a communist country? And how should people draw a distinction?
Bueno, los países nórdicos no son estrictamente hablando socialistas ni capitalistas, sino que han logrado combinar elementos de estos dos sistemas. Por ejemplo, cuentan con una economía de mercado abierta muy desarrollada y una cultura del emprendimiento, además de que incentivan la competencia. Por otro lado, el gobierno tiene una baja regulación de la actividad económica y tiene un fuerte sector privado al que deja trabajar, además de que el gobierno deja llegar a acuerdos libremente entre empresarios y sindicatos de trabajadores. Lo que sí que es verdad, y es un elemento socialista, es que estos países tienen altas tasas impositivas que pueden llegar del 40 hasta el 50%, con lo cual el gobierno se financia para poder proporcionar un estado de bienestar a la población.
Well, I would distinguish between social democracy, which is, the left that we have usually in the Western world, in the developed nations, people like Biden or people like Justin Trudeau, people like that, who can be very far left when it comes to the woke issues and all of these value conflicts that we have now in the West. And I believe that they are responsible for endorsing an ideology that will end up destroying the West if they are successful in the end. But they are not these revolutionary socialists that we have now in Latin America,
Exacto.
or that we used to have in the Western world during the Cold War. Like you had them in Italy and France, you had them in Germany, you had terrorist groups that were fighting against the establishment, being funded by the Soviet Union, and so on. So I would make a distinction there. And also, if you have countries with more solid institutions, even within Latin America, they are never able to achieve their goal of concentrating power in their own hands. Like Chile is a good example of that. We had a constitutional referendum a couple of years ago, and the left proposed a very
ahora lo que
radical
se quiere
constitution, a very
hacer aquí en
woke
México.
constitution, but at the same time,
Cambiar la
communist
constitución.
constitution. And over 60% of Chileans voted against that. So we were saved by this decision in the referendum. So they failed in their attempt to, to control power. So I would say in the classical definition of socialism and Marxism or communism, they used to be more or less the same during the Cold War. I mean, it would be hard to argue that a socialist was not at the same time someone who believed in the Soviet Union type of system, central planned economy. This is a point that Hayek and Mises were making during the Cold War, fighting against the socialists, because the socialists were arguing for a central planned economy, which in the end would have destroyed all sort of political liberties and democracy as well. So I would distinguish more, as I said, between the Social Democrats, and within the Social Democrats you have also more extreme type of people than others,
Sí, claro
and
que hay
the
una
socialists and
distinción.
communists.
Pero
And
siguen
even if
existiendo.
some political parties have the name of socialist, nowadays they're more like social democrats than true socialists that are inspired 100% by the Marxist and Leninist doctrine that they followed in the times of the Cold War. So that's a distinction I would make.
Sí, efectivamente coincido con Alex Kaiser. No se puede decir que la socialdemocracia tenga ideas comunistas recalcitrantes como en la Guerra Fría, pero creo que un socialdemócrata se mueve más al centro de lo que es el espectro de la izquierda. Sin embargo, hay uno que otro por ahí que se dice socialdemócrata, pero que aún muy en el fondo sí sueña con poder tener una economía totalmente planificada y centralizada por un Estado omnipresente. Es decir, es un comunista con piel de oveja. Además, un comunista marxista sí está dispuesto a tomar el poder por medio de la violencia y las armas, a diferencia de un socialdemócrata que lo hace por la vía del voto popular. Aunque también hay que decir que hay los que se dicen demócratas y que cuando llegan al poder sacan a flote su comunismo. Pregúntale cómo le ha ido al pueblo de Venezuela con estos personajes. Lamentablemente sí creo que hay algunos líderes latinoamericanos que tienen características meramente comunistas. A ver, vamos a continuar con el próximo fragmento. Era en el minuto más o menos por... A ver, ahí.
So Venezuela is an interesting case because it had the highest per capita income in Latin America in 1970, and it was the country with the largest degree of economic freedom. You can measure that. The Fraser Institute in Canada does that work of measuring economic freedom. And in 1970, Venezuela was 14 in the world in terms of economic freedom. It was about like 90 countries, more or less, that they were measuring back then. Chile was one of the last countries because we had the socialist experiment of Salvador Allende, which was an attempt to impose a totalitarian communist system in Chile. And we were last in the country, and we had hyperinflation and scarcity of basic goods and services and so on and so forth. So it was a complete catastrophe that ended up in the coup of 1973, led by General Pinochet. But Venezuela, over time and over the decades, especially after they nationalized in the 70s the oil industry, we have to remember Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. They nationalized it, and they started falling in the ranking of economic freedom systematically. So by the time Chavez came to power in 1988, Venezuela was doing very poorly in the rankings of economic freedom. You had a very kleptocratic, corrupt system that, a rent-seeking society, let's say. Everyone was trying to live out of the government handouts and corrupt deals between the corporate interest and the politicians. And Chavez was elected. He had been a soldier who had attempted a coup in 1992 against Carlos Andrés Pérez. So he was a golpista, what we call a golpista in Spanish. So someone who tried to overthrow a democratically elected president and install a dictatorship. So everyone knew who Chavez was. Many people died in 1992, and he ended up in prison. But well-meaning central leftists in Venezuela pardoned him so he could go out of jail. And then he went to see Fidel Castro, and Fidel Castro recognized immediately that he had, a puppet that he could guide in order to take control over Venezuela.
Bueno, aquí Axel está haciendo una síntesis de cómo los líderes comunistas llegaron al poder posteriores a Fidel Castro. Castro vendría a ser como el abuelito al que lo veneraban y al que le pedían consejo personajes como Chávez, y fue Castro el que les dijo el ABC de cómo usar el poder para enquistarse en el mismo por medio de la represión y la cooptación de los poderes legislativo y judicial. A ver, mexicanos, ¿les suena algo esto? ¿Les hace sentido? Ok, muy bien, continuemos.
So Castro and Cuba, they have been the masterminds behind what is going on in this country, and they have, extracted huge sums of wealth from Venezuela because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, at some point Russia stopped funding the Cuban dictatorship,
Exacto.
and so Venezuela played that role. And Chavez saw in Fidel Castro a fatherly figure for him. And this is really an important thing because he was loyal to Fidel until the very end. And the intelligence services from Cuba, who are very effective, we have to say, in consolidating power. They have been there in Cuba for over 60 years, so they know what they're doing. These are the people advising the regime as to what to do to deal with the opposition and to purge the military and things like that.
Sí.
But Venezuela was already in a situation where they had lost their economic freedom, and the per capita incomes, as compared to other countries in Latin America, started to fall dramatically. While Chile embraced free market reforms, especially influenced by the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman and Arnold Harberger, George Stigler, and people like that, and we became the wealthiest country in per capita terms in Latin America. And so you can see that in the 70s, Chile was at the bottom of the economic freedom ranking. We went up to the top, even top 10 at some point, and we became the wealthiest country in Latin America. And Venezuela, the complete opposite. They went from being the freest country in Latin America to now the last country in the ranking in the world, 162 among 162 countries that are measured, and it's a complete disaster. And this is socialism. This is what I mean. So the Nordic countries are really on the top countries in terms of economic freedom. These are not really socialist countries.
Es correcto. Esto es lo que platicábamos hace unos momentos sobre las distinciones de un país puramente socialista y otro país de libre mercado. Y los países nórdicos para mí es la mezcla de ambos, por lo que no se puede catalogar como socialistas o capitalistas en la más estricta definición de la palabra. Muy bien, vamos a ver qué más. Dice por acá, a ver. Ahí.
We have to remember that Maduro was chosen by Chavez as his successor. And the reason for this was that Maduro, compared to Diosdado Cabello, who is another criminal and one of the main leaders of this Soles cartel, Maduro is a doctrinaire. He was the hardcore socialist. And he was foreign affairs minister to the Chavez administration. And he was instrumental in building up the whole network of Venezuela and the Chavismo on an international level, in Europe, in Asia, in different parts. And Chavez aligned himself very rapidly with Russia and with Iran and with China. So this is part of the Cold War that we are experiencing. Venezuela is playing for them. And now we have, and I want to stress this, Jordan, because it's important. You have a minimum wage of $3 in Venezuela. You have accumulated inflation of 2 million% or more. You have collapse of 70% of GDP, 70%. You have a collapse of over 80% of oil production in Venezuela. And they have squandered almost $1 trillion
Wow.
in wealth. Because when Chavez came to power, you had a barrel of oil at $8 or so. And it skyrocketed to over $120. So only because of that, they got almost $1 trillion. They destroyed all of that wealth. And people say, oh, this is, Caribbean type of politics. This is the result of socialism. Everywhere you go and you see what the socialists, when they implement this system, and again, I don't mean the Nordic type of welfare state, which is not socialism, not real socialism at least, they destroy the country where they run it. It's you can see it in Eastern Germany as compared to Western Germany during the Cold War. It was a very poor country compared to Western Germany and so on. I mean, everyone knows the different examples, North Korea, South Korea, and so on and so forth. But it's important to remember that Fidel Castro Cuba and Russia, Vladimir Putin, and Iran Hezbollah are behind Maduro.
Y luego hay personas que se enojan cuando escuchan los datos de cómo el régimen chavista llevó a la miseria a su gente y al colapso en el que están hoy en día. En un video anterior también reaccioné a un clip donde se expone con datos de cómo se fue destruyendo sistemáticamente a Venezuela desde la expropiación de inmuebles y empresas que Chávez hizo alegremente, así, literal, por sus bolas. Los grandes ingresos que obtuvieron por sus reservas petroleras y la exportación de crudo eran enormes, y todo eso se quedó perdido en la corrupción para mantener bien aceitado al régimen. ¿Y saben qué es lo más triste de todo esto? Que aún con los datos en la cara, hay gente que defiende a Nicolás Maduro a capa y espada. O sea, aman al tirano que los mantiene en el hambre con migajas, porque muchos de ellos dudo que sean altos rangos o funcionarios de gobierno. Pero también tengo que reconocer que muchísima gente ya está cansada de su situación y salieron a las calles a luchar y a manifestarse. Y lamentablemente muchos de ellos están desaparecidos o torturados. Y la gente vive y está con miedo de salir nuevamente a manifestarse o a luchar.
I have to stress this because this is not only a Venezuelan problem. This is going to be a crucial problem for the United States and for national security in the United States.
Well, let's dig into that. One of the other, so there's 4 things I'd like to cover as we move forward right now. I want to talk more about the opposition in Venezuela and what you think people outside Venezuela can do to aid the opposition. I want to talk about the ordinary life of the typical Venezuelan now. I want to talk about where that $1 trillion went, and maybe we can do that while talking about your claim, for example, that the Maduro government has basically also become a narco dictatorship. Now, you made a variety of extremely serious allegations, the misuse of $1 trillion certainly being one of them, but then you also said, well, the Maduro government is in bed with the narco cartels. And see, I don't think people in North America exactly understand what that means.
Se dice que este cártel empezó a operar más o menos allá a los inicios de la década de los 90, cuando Venezuela estaba pasando por una gran inestabilidad política y social. Tanto Estados Unidos como otros países han impuesto sanciones a funcionarios del gobierno venezolano por estar involucrados directamente con estas actividades ilícitas. En diciembre del 2023, un narcotraficante venezolano llamado Carlos Orense, alias El Gordo, así le decían, fue enjuiciado por un tribunal de Estados Unidos por ser una de las cabezas de esta red de narcotráfico, y él soltó la sopa diciendo que estos altos rangos militares contribuían directamente con esta actividad criminal. Según dijeron las autoridades norteamericanas, que El Gordo junto con los altos mandos militares andaban moviendo más o menos alrededor de 40 toneladas de cocaína al año. El régimen de Maduro obviamente lo encubrió y se hizo de la vista gorda porque sabía que sus altos mandos militares estaban involucrados directamente.
Or exactly how nefarious those cartels are and what a danger they pose, well, to the stability of the entire Western Hemisphere. But then you also added to that the fact that Maduro is in cahoots with, well, Cuba, Iran, Russia, and then Hezbollah.
Exacto.
And so this is a lot for people to digest because it sounds like a stew generated by a conspiracy theorist in a sense, right? Because there's almost nothing that is bad that you're not accusing the Maduro government of participating in. And so the easiest thing for a listener to do is to just say no to all that. So we should walk through those issues one by one. I guess the thing I'm most curious about to begin with, let's do it in this order. What the hell happened to $1 trillion? Like, that's an awful lot of money. Where do you think most of that, especially given that you have a 70% collapse in GDP and an 80% reduction in oil production? It's like, and then everybody in Venezuela is poor, and yet $1 trillion came pouring in. So what's your sense of who that money went to, and like what sort of people did that money go to, and what are they doing with that money?
So part of the money funded some very existentialist social programs at some point during the Chavez administration. But a large part of it went to fund revolutionary groups and political parties all over Latin America. We have to remember that the Castro vision, which is the important figure, I think, here, the Castro vision was to spread the revolution all over Latin America. In his worldview, what he was doing, believe it or not, is Christ's work on earth. Like, he was bringing paradise to earth. He said that literally many times. So Castro had been educated by the Jesuits in Cuba, and he believed that capitalism and, liberal democracy, individualism were the sources of corruption.
Según
that Christ was the first communist revolutionary. And this is, by the way, something very similar to what Pope Francis said at some point when he argued that it was the communists who thought like the Christians. He said that literally, Pope Francis, who is a Jesuit himself. So, and Castro was promising to create this, but this had to be an expansionist project. So when Chavez came to power and he had all of these resources in his pockets, plenty of them went to Cuba, of course, to sustain the island. But then he started supporting different regimes or movements and terrorist organizations all over Latin America.
Es correcto.
At some point, I had this conversation with former President Álvaro Uribe, who is also a good friend. At some point, he told me I was the only non-leftist, non-socialist president in most of South America.
A ver, esto de que las dictaduras se apoyen entre ellas económicamente no es novedad, pues Fidel Castro les asesoraba y les daba el know-how a cambio de cuantiosas sumas de dinero para la dictadura cubana. Por supuesto, esto era para que la cúpula castrista siga viviendo como reyes mientras su pueblo pasa hambre y grandes penurias. Hay que decir que la ayuda de Venezuela a Cuba no ha sido solo con plata, sino también con petróleo a tipos preferenciales. Pero, debido a la crisis por la que atraviesa Venezuela, esos apoyos se han reducido considerablemente. No se nos olvide también que China y Rusia han sido los grandes patrocinadores también de Cuba y han invertido en proyectos de infraestructura y acuerdos comerciales bilaterales en diversos sectores. Nicaragua y México también en menor medida han apoyado a los cubanos, pues si se fijan, son países que simpatizan con el ideal socialista y que pretenden implementar en los países que gobiernan. Ahí tenemos al Foro de Puebla, que reúne a toda esa fauna del más rancio socialismo latinoamericano.
Another element of the corruption, and that's you described Maduro as a narco, the Maduro regime as a narco dictatorship. So talk to everyone, if you would, a little bit about the role of the cartels in Central and South America, because that's not something that's well understood in North America at all.
Well, by the way, people who think I'm making these things up, they can Google it. It's all online. This is you can see in very serious media. You can read articles about this. So the United States, they know about this, about the Iran connection, about the drug cartels, and so on and so forth. But now in Latin America, because this is including Mexico, we have a problem that more and more the cartels are taking over politics.
Exacto.
And you don't need to do the revolution. And actually, this is really interesting. Chavez used to be a proponent of what he called 21st century socialism. That is what he used to talk about. We are doing 21st century socialism. So what did that mean? After the fall of the Berlin Wall, they came all together in Brazil, the Sao Paulo Forum with Lula and so on. And they said, okay, we are going to use democracy. We are going to use democracy in order to create a socialist system.
Esto es absolutamente cierto, y para muestra ahí está el Grupo de Puebla, que busca la implementación e integración de políticas progresistas en la región, y que entre sus filas tiene integrantes tan nefastos como Mario Delgado, Rafael Correa, ¿quién más? Lula da Silva, Evo Morales, la impresentable Irene Montero, sí, esa que se dedicó a destruir y a dividir a la sociedad española con sus funestas políticas de género en España, y que tristemente ahora está asesorando a Claudia Sheinbaum. Y sigue la lista, con personajes como Rodríguez Zapatero, ¿quién más? Dilma Rousseff, Zoé Robledo o Alicia Bárcena, esta diplomática aplaudidora y obediente de López Obrador.
And at some point, the regime itself, especially with Diosdado Cabello, who is a very high up in the Maduro administration, became a cartel boss. Now you have regions in Venezuela, but also in Mexico. In Mexico, for instance, 30% of the Mexican territory is controlled by the cartels. 30%.
Es poquito,
In Venezuela, you have complete regions, complete states that are being run by the cartels.
También.
Okay, and now we have a country like Chile that used to be a safe country, like the most advanced country. The cartels are taking over complete regions of the country.
No, y esta cifra del 30% se me hace muy bajita. Estoy casi seguro que las fuerzas del narcotráfico aquí en México han permeado mucho más en estos últimos 6 años. Si bien es cierto, este problema tiene décadas que los mexicanos lo padecemos. Mi apreciación es que esto se acentuó mucho más en este sexenio, pues lejos de combatir a los cárteles, la consigna es de abrazos y no balazos. Si a eso le sumas que han estado soltando a grandes capos de la mafia, como el Ratón, el hijo del Chapo, y la vergonzosa escena del presidente bajándose de su camioneta para saludar a la mamá del Chapo Guzmán y decir que ya recibió su carta, pues ya no hay ni siquiera pudor, ni cuidar las formas, carajo. El narco en México está desde el nivel más bajo como en los municipios, hasta nivel federal y con altos mandos del ejército. El trasiego de drogas sigue en aumento y nada de lo que se prometió en campaña de brindar seguridad a la población se hizo. Por el contrario, se le brindó seguridad, pero al narco. Ok, continuemos, seguimos. Creo que este clip que quiero comentar era por...
I'm wondering, let me step sideways for a moment and then we'll return to our discussion about Venezuela and South America in general. You know, I don't think it's really appropriate now to conceptualize what's happening around the world, but particularly in the West, in political terms precisely, because it's something deeper than what's merely political. And one of the ideas I've been toying with, I'd like your opinion about it, is that the default human moral stance is probably left-wing. You know, Ben Shapiro said something to me at one point, just off the cuff, that tangled its way into my thinking, and I suppose is one of the motivations for this idea that he said he's a communist in his family. And so, you know, if you have a family, if you have children, you're really hoping for something like, at least a part of you is hoping, especially when they're kids, for something like equality of outcome. You want everyone to do well. You're willing to intervene on the side of the person who's
100%.
Bearing who's not quite as successful at any given moment. You want to distribute resources as equitably as possible. Your interaction with your children and your wife is based on essentially an ethos of care. But, you know, if you look at organizations that move beyond the scope of the family in size, that ethos of care and equitable care, let's say, doesn't scale well.
Es una realidad esto que apunta Jordan, pues justamente como padre de familia, busco que mis hijas y la distribución de lo que les proveemos sea lo más igualitario posible, sin ningún tipo de preferencia, y es una preocupación realmente genuina, pues hay un vínculo familiar muy fuerte que nos une a ellas. Seré franco y diré realmente que no sé si ese vínculo se puede desarrollar con otro ser humano que no sea tu familia. Podrás tener un amigo muy cercano y lo que sea, pero siento que el vínculo tan fuerte al grado de estar dispuesto de dar la vida por una hija sin chistar, no se desarrolla con nadie más. Repito, no lo sé, pero eso es lo que yo siento. Por eso cuando se trata de escalar el socialismo a una magnitud mayor, es que no funciona bien. Justamente hace poco leí un libro de Gerald Alan Cohen que se llama ¿Por qué no el socialismo?, que dicho sea de paso, fue uno de los máximos exponentes del marxismo analítico. Y bueno, en su libro hace una analogía de cómo funciona el socialismo, pero en un nivel reducido de participantes, en este caso en un campamento con pocas personas, donde analiza la factibilidad de este ideal socialista. También hace un análisis sobre los obstáculos con los que se encuentra el socialismo cuando se trata de implementarlo a escalas mayores en la sociedad y las consecuencias negativas que esto acarrea, debido a factores principalmente como el egoísmo humano, y se pregunta si en realidad el socialismo es quizá una tecnología social pobre. Al final de su libro, Cohen concluye que el socialismo a gran escala no es factible por dos cuestiones principales. La primera es por los límites que plantea la naturaleza humana. Afirma que el humano no es lo suficientemente generoso, ni tiene el espíritu cooperativo necesario para cumplir con los requisitos del socialismo. Más allá de que las personas podemos estar dispuestas a cooperar en situaciones con un marco limitado de tiempo, como por ejemplo en una emergencia, en un accidente. Y la segunda razón es porque en el supuesto que el humano fuera lo suficientemente generoso, no sabríamos cómo canalizar esa generosidad, y tampoco sabríamos cómo lograr mediante reglas y estímulos apropiados que la generosidad se convierta en el motor de la economía, en contraste con el egoísmo humano, que sí que lo conocemos muy bien y que sabemos bien cómo canalizarlo. Finalmente, Cohen concluye que el principal problema para la implementación del socialismo es un problema de diseño incompatible con la naturaleza humana. Obvio, aquí estoy resumiendo las razones, pero si les interesa profundizar, los invito a que vayan a leer su libro.
And modern civilizations are not families. And here's some proof of that from the psychological perspective. So the personality trait agreeableness is associated with maternal care. Let's say it's the dimension of empathic, self-sacrificial care. And women are substantially higher in trait agreeableness across the world than men.
Exacto, sí.
What predicts
sin duda.
Success in a complex society on the personality side isn't agreeableness. In fact, managers who are more agreeable do worse because people take advantage of them. What predicts success on the personality side in a large-scale society is conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is dutifulness and industriousness and orderliness. And it's the ethos of hard work. It's a meritocratic ethos. And it's a cold virtue. Like, to be conscientious isn't the same as to be emotionally caring. And so I wonder if part of the reason that the politics of the left, so to speak, constantly mutate and transform, they're immune to criticism, say, by reference to history. You can't just say, well, every communist regime in the 20th century was a brutal, bloody, dictatorial disaster. It doesn't hold water. Maybe it doesn't hold water because it's actually extremely difficult to socialize people so that they can take their place in a complex society without defaulting to the underlying ethos of familial care. And so if you're a harsh and discriminating person, if you're very meritocratically oriented, if you say to someone, I don't give a damn about your feelings, it matters what sort of job you do, you're a harsh voice. And you might be a necessary voice to keep civilization itself running, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily an attractive voice, especially to people who think instinctively in terms of an ethos of care. And it's very, very easy to appeal to that. And so I think part of the problem, and then you might add to that another problem. So imagine that if you're driven by necessity when times are hard, it becomes obvious that those who can should be allowed to do or should be pushed forward to do, that the meritocratic have to rise to the top because otherwise disaster looms. If you've been in a situation where economic security has been granted to you in some ways effortlessly for several generations even, it's also perhaps much easier to default to that ethos of care and to attend to the outliers in society who haven't served themselves well, but also perhaps haven't been served well by the conscientious ethos. And so I'm wondering about your thoughts of that, because we usually think about this, well, some people have left-wing beliefs and some people have right-wing beliefs, and that's the battlefield. It's like, I don't think that's a good level of analysis because I don't exactly think this is about ideas. I think the default human position might be equality of outcome in small groups, and that you have to struggle against that mightily with your education system, maybe your moral system as a whole, to impose a meritocratic, like a cold virtue meritocracy on top of that. And obviously, we haven't been doing a very good job of that. So I'm curious, you're well-versed in the Austrian School of Economics. I'm wondering what you think of that kind of theorizing.
No, I fully agree. And this is really interesting because Friedrich Hayek wrote a paper called The Mirage of Social Justice, where he argued exactly what you are saying. He said that this idea of social justice, that we had to, redistribute wealth so everyone gets an equal share, or in terms that guarantee the survival of the community. It's an idea that he attributes to our past. For thousands of years, we were small communities, tribes, basically. We had this family ethos, the care ethos, and it was the way to survive. But we were communities only of a couple of dozen people, or maybe over 100, but not more than that. You knew everyone.
Exactamente, porque cuando se trata de grupos reducidos como la propia familia, estás dispuesto a ceder parte de tus preferencias o libertades, ya que son tus familiares y ese vínculo es muy poderoso, y sin que nos demos cuenta lo hacemos de manera natural. Sin embargo, cuando se trata de un desconocido, quizás puedas ceder o incluso cooperar con él sin ningún interés de por medio, pero ya cuando se trata de hacerlo de manera recurrente, no estoy tan seguro de que las cosas vayan a funcionar, ya que los incentivos que nos mueven son distintos.
And this is the instincts. He says we evolved in this type of environment, and so socialism in the end wants to apply this moral instincts to the what he called the complex society, the larger society, which is civilization basically. And that's why you have this regression towards tribalism. And you have it with socialism and communism and with nationalism. When nationalism is exacerbated, like the Nazis did in Germany, then you go back to the tribe and you feel protected by the tribe. And you have this unifying rhetoric and this identity. And you are, you're again like this organism and you're part of a whole. You're not just an individual looking for yourself. And this is the care ethics ethos that you were talking about. It's really interesting also because Gerald Cohen, who was a very famous Marxist, a professor at Oxford University, he said, he wrote the book, Why Not Socialism?
Este es exactamente el libro que les platiqué hace unos momentos, donde se expone las razones de por qué el socialismo no es factible ni funcional a gran escala. Y eso que el autor es marxista. Y recordemos que el estadio principal para poder saltar al comunismo es el socialismo, según Marx. Entonces, ¿cómo llegar a ese ideal comunista si su fase inicial socialista no es factible?
And by socialism, he didn't mean Nordic type of welfare state or something like that. He meant like really equality of outcomes, more or less. And he was saying, and he said that the instinct, the socialist ideology, the socialist philosophy appealed to an instinct that was so ingrained in human nature that it was going to come back over and over and over again. So I fully agree with that analysis. And this is why civilization is so fragile.
Okay, let me add 2 data points to that, okay, or 3. So we did a study in 2016 looking at personality and cognitive predictors of politically correct authoritarianism. So that wouldn't be democratic socialism. That would be the far left authoritarian types. And the things that predicted it were low verbal intelligence, which was a walloping predictor. So you could imagine it's a very simple narrative, right? There are victims and there are victimizers.
Exacto.
That explains everything.
Justo
and
lo
if
que
you're
se hace
moral, you're
hoy.
on the side of the victims. And that's
Malos.
something like a predatory
Falsas
infant
dicotomías.
instinct, right? There are predators, there are infants. You're obviously on the side of the infants, and to hell with the predators. So you can think of that as an instinctual orientation and an effective one under certain conditions. Okay, what else predicted? Feminine temperament, high agreeableness in particular. And then there's the other data point I would say is that if you look in the United States right now, the people who are holding the radical utopians in power are women between 18 and 34. Okay, and now they're particularly targeted by the Iranians and the Chinese on TikTok, right? And they're bombarded with images, for example, of dying Palestinian children. And that's a targeted attack. We know that the Iranians are behind that and the Chinese, and it's extremely effective. And women between the ages of 18 and 34 are wildly discordant in their political views in relationship to everyone else. Now, 50% of them are also childless.
Wow.
Right. So there's an element of the maternal instinct run amok on the political landscape, because you could easily say, and I don't think that it's an exaggeration, and our empirical data supported that, is that that maternal instinct is going to find its target. It's going to find its expression. If it doesn't find its expression within the confines of a family, where there's some real demand to take care of those who are unable to take care of themselves, children essentially, infants primarily, then it's going to find its expression politically, and that can be exploited, as it certainly is by the Chinese and the Iranians on TikTok.
Bueno, creo que este video ya se está haciendo tremendamente largo, pero bueno, acá en esencia, Jordan Peterson dice que hizo algunos estudios que yo no he visto. Sin embargo, coincido con lo que ha dicho, básicamente con que nuestra sociedad es tremendamente tribalista y se exacerba ese sentimiento con la finalidad de sobresimplificar la manera en que interpretamos la realidad. De hecho, en su libro Neoinquisición, Axel Kaiser profundiza en este tema. Bien, aquí voy a terminar el video porque ya quedó demasiado largo y el podcast dura aproximadamente 1 hora y media. Pero bueno, creo que ya tocamos los ítems principales que ellos tocaron también en el podcast. Entonces, pues yo hasta aquí me voy a quedar. Bien, gente, por mi parte ha sido todo. No me resta más que decirles que por favor le den like, compartan o comenten, ya que esto me ayuda a que el algoritmo me dé un poco más de visibilidad y esto a su vez pues me incentiva a seguir haciendo estas video reacciones. Ok, nos vemos pronto. Cuídense. Adiós.